It's very loud, this mic. Hold it down here. No, I'm just a quiet, shrinking violet. So welcome, one and all, to the 9th edition of Power Hour. Yes, believe it or not, the Australian Chamber of Commerce Macau has done 9 of these things. It feels like just a few months ago we were talking about it, but this is the 9th, so we've been going 9 months. So thank you all for coming. It's good to see so many familiar faces, 1 or 2 unfamiliar faces, which is also good to see. Some variety, and for any unfamiliar faces who might not happen to be members of the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Macau, or indeed for any familiar faces that might not happen not to be members, please do consider joining our little chamber. It's only $1,500 for an individual, and you won't have to pay 100 mop to come and see this. So please give that some consideration. You can see Sharon, who is probably outside, or you can also visit our website, AustCham.mo. There she is, AustCham.mo. Please go and check it out and see all the shenanigans we get up to. We have an extremely interesting discussion today, which I think is interesting on 2 fronts, one obvious and one not so obvious. It's the intersection of 2 things that I think are very interesting. The obvious one, of course, is COVID-19, or as some people tend to say, the coronavirus, when in fact, of course, they should say a coronavirus. But and that's been dominating our lives for, 14 months now, or something like that. And it's, in my lifetime, certainly never seen something that has been so pervasive to every single country in the world, and perhaps even almost every single person in the world. It's pretty amazing. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and particularly of some import to me as a media and communications professional, is about misinformation. When I was a lad, sound like my dad now. When I was a lad, there were like 3 TV stations or 4 TV stations. They each had a dozen reporters, and they were the trusted sources of information. Now, anybody with a couple of $1,000 can set up their own media empire in their mom's basement, and away they go. So we now have all this information, some of it true, most of it not, and there's lots of misinformation, and hence we now live in this so-called post-truth world, which I think is very dangerous. So the discussion today will be about COVID-19 and about correct information about COVID-19, which I think will be really interesting. So would you please join with me in welcoming our very esteemed guest, Professor Brian Tomlinson from the Macau University of Science and Technology.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I'm not sure that the information I'm going to tell you is going to be entirely correct. Things change day by day with COVID, and on a lot of my slides I put the date because it's quite important. You know, what I tell you today may be different tomorrow. So I'm going to start off with this league table, and I'm sure most of you look at this now and again and wonder what's going on. And you can see on the left the top 10 countries in the league in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths. And you can see on the right countries towards the bottom. They're not in order, they're not in the order exactly, but I picked out the countries which would be interesting to the audience here, and the countries which have a good record. So you can see at the bottom end, Australia's doing very well, Hong Kong's doing pretty well, Taiwan's doing well, and Macau has done extremely well. You know, Macau comes out best in a way, no deaths. But the other end of the scale, you know, now of course I come from the UK, and if we look at the figures from the UK here, and we compare it with the other countries, you have to think about the figures in terms of the population. And the UK sort of matches the United States, I think, in terms of number of cases and number of deaths per population. So why have those two countries done rather badly? Well, why has Australia done well? Here's Anthony Fauci praising Australia because of their lockdowns, which have been very effective. And he points out that viruses don't mutate unless they replicate. You know, so Australia's done a very good job. Macau's done a very good job. Unfortunately, UK didn't do such a good job. This was a picture that was sent to me last year. This is the president of the Royal College of Physicians. It's just called the Royal College of Physicians. It's actually of London, but they don't put the London bit on because it's obvious. Now, he sent this out in the weekly email. And I thought, well, is this a joke? Is this a joke? This is the PPE that they were recommending in England last year. So the first thing I did was look at the date. I thought maybe this is the 1st of April. But it wasn't. It wasn't the 1st of April. It was March. You know, this looks like something you would use in a butcher's shop or an abattoir. It's not what a frontline doctor would be using, I don't think. I mean, not in my opinion anyway. You know, I thought this is a joke. I thought it's horrendous. You know, how can they be recommending this in the UK? And this was the approach recommended by the top officials in the UK, Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer. They were going for herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is okay. Herd immunity is good if you can protect the vulnerable population and if you can protect the healthcare system. But I think in March last year, they would have been aware of this gentleman from Wuhan, who was a doctor, who was one of the first people to alert the nation about the outbreak in Wuhan. And he was 33, and he caught it from a patient, and he died. You know, so we know that healthcare workers are vulnerable. Even if they're young and fit and have no other disease, they are vulnerable. So, whilst I'm talking about Wuhan, I mean, the report of the WHO has not come out yet, I think. I haven't seen it. I don't know that anyone's got the report, but it seems that the virus didn't come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And in fact, a very recent paper just published a couple of weeks ago would suggest, looking at the genetics of the virus, that it did come directly from a bat or through some intermediate mammal, maybe some small mammal that may be being farmed in China, but probably not from the pangolin. Anyway, so that's the current theory, but we wait to see what the WHO have to say. Now, although UK did rather badly in controlling the number of cases, I would say they've done very well in putting out the vaccine. Boris Johnson looks to have aged a bit during the process. He's looking a bit sort of worried nowadays, but they are doing very well with putting out the vaccine. I underline the word first there because I think he shouldn't have a second dose as he already had the infection, you know, and if you've had the infection once, you don't need 2 doses of the vaccine usually. But anyway, that's how it goes. But having said the UK is doing well in that, there is the problem that at least 850 healthcare workers have died within a period of last year, and there is a bit some talk of having an inquiry into what went wrong. Anyway, moving on to the other side of the world, you'll recognize this gentleman here who is observing this elderly lady in a care home in Australia, and she's having her first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in February this year. Now, Scott Morrison also received his first dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, same day. I don't know whether he had it before or after the lady, whether he wanted to make sure it was okay and he tested it on the lady first. And I don't know the significance of the shirt he's put on there. Probably Australians will recognize this as being something important. Is it? So anyway, he changed his shirt between these two pictures for some reason. And it's pointed out that Australia is catching up or maybe overtaking the UK in turning out the vaccine, and they're largely using the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is made in Australia. So that's good. So some questions about the vaccine. These are the sort of questions that people will typically ask. How do the vaccines work? What are their adverse effects? Can they alter my DNA? What about ADEs? What about variants? Do we need a booster? Now, these are the 3 vaccines approved in the United States. The Johnson & Johnson Janssen one was approved fairly recently, and they're just considering the AstraZeneca vaccine. They haven't approved it yet, as far as I'm aware. So these are the Pfizer, BioNTech, the Moderna, the mRNA vaccines, and then the Johnson & Johnson, which is an adenovirus-based vaccine. And the odd thing about the Pfizer-BioNTech is it has to be stored at a very low temperature, which makes it a bit difficult to distribute. Now, looking at the 4 main different vaccines, the inactivated vaccines, which are the 2 ones from China, Sinovac and Sinopharm, the efficiency seems to be about something like 60 or 70%. So this is how they act. I won't go into the details of that, I think, for the sake of time. Then there are the vaccines which are based on a subunit of the virus, of the spike protein. None of those have actually reached the stage of being marketed. They're in development. So those are interesting, but we don't have the data on them yet. And the other 2 are the mRNA vaccine, the BioNTech Pfizer and the Moderna, and then the adenovirus-based vaccines. So here we have Janssen vaccine, AstraZeneca, and the Russian Sputnik, and there's another one from China, CanSino. Now, in terms of altering DNA, I think the main worry is with the adenovirus-based vaccines, because adenovirus has been used to alter DNA previously in other circumstances. There is no evidence that the adenoviruses used in the vaccines can alter the DNA. All the evidence says it cannot. But that is a question which is often asked. Now, this was an alarming piece of news which came out, and this picture comes from a medical report on the internet. There was 23 deaths in Norway in very elderly people who were quite sick to start with when they had the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. This has not been totally explained as far as I can see, but it was said that there were a lot of people in that age group who were dying in Norway at that time, and it seems that these people probably died either of the COVID-19 infection just after having the vaccine, when they wouldn't have had any immunity, or they died from their underlying disease. And I don't know the outcome of that. It's not been published as far as I know. The other thing is that some of the vaccines cause anaphylaxis. This is a severe allergic reaction. It would usually suggest that you've had some exposure to something in the vaccine previously. And this seems to be particularly with the mRNA vaccines, probably because of the lipid particle that's involved in them, and some of them contain PEG, polyethylene glycol, which is present in other things. So a very small number of people get this anaphylaxis, and that's why you're asked to stay around for 30 minutes after having the vaccine. some of the vaccines, and this is the Moderna vaccine, do cause a sort of delayed, quite large cutaneous reaction near the site of the vaccination. Now, this usually resolves spontaneously. It might need some medication, but not a serious problem, I think. What has been concerning this week, which are within the week, is with the AstraZeneca vaccine and thrombosis. And it's been largely resolved in a way, but it's interesting because this is not the usual thrombosis. It's a thrombosis in the veins inside the skull, the central sinus venous thrombosis. And it's a very unusual type of thrombosis, and there are 18 cases of this. But overall, because there are so many people having the vaccine, the frequency is the same as in the population. But it's unusual. All these people had a low platelet count. And it was very soon after the vaccine. So one would imagine it has some relationship to the vaccine, but it is so infrequent that it should not prevent the vaccine being used. And it's still under investigation in Germany, particularly. And it's very similar to a condition that we see when we give people the anticoagulant heparin. It produces this sort of thing as well in a very small number of people. So it's probably some sort of genetic predisposition, but we don't understand it yet. Now, what about ADE? What's ADE? Antibody-dependent enhancement of immunity. This is the so-called Trojan horse pathway, that having an infection or having a vaccine can produce antibodies which don't necessarily neutralize another infection. And it allows a virus to gain entry to cells which it wouldn't normally get into because the antibodies are sort of carrying it into cells. And the classic example comes from dengue. And because there are 4 different strains of dengue which are sufficiently different, having immunity to one does not protect you from another. In fact, it endangers you to another. And in fact, there was the Sanofi Pasteur vaccine for dengue which was released in the Philippines, and some of the children who had this subsequently developed very severe infection. Some died, and so the vaccine was put on hold. So that is a potential problem with some vaccines. And it was recognized at the beginning of developing the COVID-19 vaccines that this might be a problem. And that's why they focused on the spike protein rather than the overall virus. And some of the inactivated whole cell or kill vaccines that use an alum adjuvant could potentially be a risk. That was the case with the old measles and respiratory virus vaccines back in the 1960s. And this statement comes from a professor in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, so presumably supported by a Chinese gentleman. And he was speaking about the vaccine from China. And he said it's perhaps not worth mentioning, it's never going to be approved in the United States. And there have been no actual cases of this antibody-dependent enhancement reported, but he suggested it's a possibility. I don't know whether that's true or not, but anyway, that was his opinion, one expert from the United States. It should not happen with the RNA viruses because they are very specific against the spike protein. Now, what about the variants of COVID? Are we going to see a lot of variants? Is it going to be a problem? This diagram compares the spike protein structure of the original SARS-CoV-1 with the current SARS-CoV-2. And you can see, in fact, that this protein structure is very, very similar. But these two viruses have developed from very separate lines. It's not one's developed from another. They've come separately, and they've ended up producing this protein structure which binds to the ACE2 enzyme. So you can see that viruses do develop in certain ways, and obviously variants develop which can multiply more easily and can multiply in people who have a certain degree of immunity. So variants are bound to develop. And in fact, a study in South Africa found that the AstraZeneca vaccine was not very effective against the South African variant, whereas other vaccines, such as the Johnson & Johnson one, were much more effective. So, again, we have to think about the problem with variants. And I think the bottom line is that variants are going to develop, and we're going to have boosters sooner or later. Not yet, but sooner. Now, that's the vaccines finished with, and we can discuss it afterwards. What about the Tamiflu approach? What do I mean by that? For influenza, if you have someone who has very close contact with an infected person, you can give them Tamiflu and hope that it helps, hope it stops them getting influenza. Do we have anything that can do this for COVID-19? Well, what about vitamin D? I have a friend and former colleague who got very excited about vitamin D and has written a book about it and made some videos on YouTube to say that it's very important to have your vitamin D level as high as possible to prevent infection. And there is evidence to support that. There is circumstantial evidence that the people who are more likely to develop severe disease are people who are likely to have vitamin D deficiency. And there is theoretical evidence vitamin D is involved in the immune response. So having a good level of vitamin D does boost your immunity. And there is observational evidence. There are a lot of clinical studies that show that people who develop COVID will have lower levels of vitamin D than people who don't develop COVID. Now, when you look at those studies, there are two things to think about. One is confounding, one is reverse causality. Confounding means having a low level of vitamin D might correlate with something else. You may have a low level of vitamin D because of your overall diet or some other activity. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's causational. And reverse causality may be that having COVID-19 infection actually causes low vitamin D, rather than low vitamin D causes the infection. So those are things to think about. And there are ongoing studies looking at supplements with vitamin D in various doses. The standard dose here is 1,000 units in one tablet or capsule. Now, my colleague recommends having 4,000 units a day, 4 capsules. There is one study that's reported here. This was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a very good journal. And the publication date, you can maybe just see, it's February 17 this year, so it's very recent. And this is a true randomized study. It was done in Brazil. And they gave patients who were admitted with COVID-19 a big dose of vitamin D, 200,000 units. Now, that doesn't mean they gave him 200 tablets of the thing on the previous page. That would be difficult to swallow. They had some concentrated preparation, so it was only 10 mil in peanut oil, so it wasn't too difficult. But the net effect of treating these people with vitamin D was nothing, no benefit. Now, of course, this is not how you take vitamin D normally, is it? You don't take a massive dose when you get ill. You really need to be taking a dose all along to keep your immune system pepped up. And my interpretation, my bottom line on this is, if you're a person who avoids sunshine, vitamin D is made by exposure to sunlight. You need to have a half an hour of good sunshine every day, at midday, an exposed part of the body, not just your face, but your arms or something, to get enough vitamin D. And a lot of people don't do that. You know, there's a lot of vitamin D deficiency here in this part of the world. So if you're one of those people who doesn't like sunshine, it might be good to take a vitamin D supplement. That's my take on it. Now, the other thing that might protect you is being on a statin. Statins are the medications that we use to reduce cholesterol and to reduce the risk of cardiovascular events. And there are various different statins, as you can see in these pictures. And again, there's a lot of literature on statins. There's a lot of theoretical evidence that statins have anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory, antithrombotic effects. So they should be good for COVID. And in fact, the observational studies, most of them, do suggest that people who are on statins do better, or maybe are less likely to develop COVID. And here is one study, again published very recently. It was a bit odd that the study was actually submitted to the journal in July last year, and now it's published in February this year. I don't know why it's such a long wait, but it's in a good journal, Nature Communications. And they do a lot of statistical juggling with the data. So you just have to think, well, is it true? Because people who are on statins usually have some underlying illness, and that underlying illness makes them vulnerable to COVID-19. So you have to sort of do this juggling about and do all this statistical analysis, and they do something called a propensity score matching, which means that you find people who are taking statin, who have a particular bunch of features like heart disease, and then you find another bunch of people who are not taking statin, who have the same sort of background, and you compare the two. And when they did that, they found that those on statin had 53% reduction in mortality over 30 days. So, I mean, that's remarkable. That's remarkable. And these who are people who are taking statin before admission to the hospital. But what it also tells you, I mean, how can you do propensity matching in a group of people who should already be on statin? You know, I mean, the question that comes out of this is, why were those people that they matched them with not on statin? And again, my bottom line on this is that there are a lot of people who are eligible to be taking statins who are not taking them. And they should be taking them. And whether or not it protects you from COVID, we don't quite know, quite frankly, but it's better that you be taking it if you're eligible. So you should go and see your doctor and find out if you should be taking a statin and start it if the doctor says you should. All right, now what about hydroxychloroquine? Hydroxychloroquine has had a lot of press. It was recommended by certain ex-presidents. But it didn't seem to prevent them getting the COVID-19 in the end. And this review paper, this is a very recent review paper. It's just been published online this month. And it comes from a couple of people. Nick White is really one of the regional experts on malaria, not on COVID-19, but on malaria. And hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine are treatments for malaria. And this was the bottom line. In hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19, the randomized controlled trials, so these are proper trials, they show that these drugs, and he's referring to hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, are not beneficial. There is no evidence, no proper clinical trial evidence that they do any good in people who are admitted to hospital with severe COVID. And they pointed out, the only treatments that are proven benefit are the immunomodulators like dexamethasone, and there's a monoclonal antibody that also helps. And his bottom line was that no antiviral drug has proven life-saving. Now, of course, there are antiviral drugs that may have some benefit, but maybe not life-saving. So when it comes to hydroxychloroquine, I think there's no evidence of benefit for treatment or prophylaxis, and you should avoid it. That's my opinion. Now, what about this one? This one is very, very, very hot, very topical. Ivamectin. Now, ivermectin is a treatment for parasites. It's a treatment for worms. It has the indications for strongyloiditis and onchocerciasis. And it's used in doses of about 150 to 200 micrograms per kilogram. So this 12 milligram dose is about one tablet you take a day for these worm infections. Now, there are a lot of people who are advocating that this is good for COVID-19, to prevent it or stop it getting worse. And the evidence was assessed by the National Institute of Health in the United States. They had previously stated that they did not recommend it. They have now changed their recommendation in February this year and say we don't know, basically, because the evidence presented to them was, of course, positive, but they are not able to recommend it or say it shouldn't be used. So basically, we're in a sort of stalemate situation. But what you should remember about ivermectin is it's used for horses. And these are some of the horse preparations. And some people in the United States have been taking these, and some people have poisoned themselves with these because it's quite difficult to get the right dose from a horse pill. And in terms of publications, there's a journal called Frontiers in Pharmacology, which is quite a good journal. They had an article coming from a group of people who called themselves the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, a self-appointed group. And they had this article in the journal, but then after reviewing from various other experts, they removed it. So in the end, the article is not published. So when it comes to ivermectin, my bottom line is don't take the horse pills. If you want to take the pill that is recommended for parasites, well, you know, the evidence is neither for or against. Some people might like to take it. I wouldn't specifically recommend it. I'll end with this nice picture again of Dr. Anthony Fauci praising Australia for their lockdowns, which have worked, and pointing out that viruses don't mutate unless they replicate. And the virus is replicating. It's replicating in many countries, and it's going to go on replicating. So we're going to have to face this problem of mutations and new vaccines, booster doses, sooner or later. So that's the end of that, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that very interesting and well laid out presentation. And I'm sure there's a wealth of questions. And if there isn't, I've got a couple of my own. So if anybody would like to stick their hand up in the air and ask a question, I'm sure Brian would love to answer it. I can see a few, yes.
Thank you, Brian, for a very stimulating and informative presentation. I'm going to sound a bit like Scott Morrison talking about his daughters, with a personal anecdote. Patricia and I had our second vaccines on Monday. Within 2 hours, I had 2 emails from Europeans. One in France was charming, but wondered why on earth I'd done that. And the second, Liberty, Fraternity, Equality, said, you must be off your mind. There's a series of determined constituency out there of anti-vaxxers. Don't we need a program of persuasion, maybe some incentives? Don't we need governments to grasp this? You know, even the blessed Angela in Germany, you'd expect, Versprung durch Technik. This is the land of technology. Take back your Siemens, your Miele, your AEG to whence it belonged. Don't we need to grasp this so that Boris, the Lord of Misrule, Scott Morrison, Weave and Duck, don't we need them? And they profess to follow the science, and yet they don't. They don't. don't we need someone to take the grip and say, look, we need a determined program of persuasion? Because, as you know, as of last week, Macau had 4%. 4%, and we need to reach 50. So there's a big issue for governments.
Yes, you're absolutely right. We need to do something to encourage people to take the vaccine. You might understand it here in Macau, where people maybe think, you're not in danger, there's no disease circulating here, why do I need the vaccine? In Australia and UK, I think they're more aware that it's going to be good for them. So it's probably progressing better. But again, as you say, there's still an anti-vaccine group of people in all of the countries. And some people would say, well, maybe having the country leader like Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson is not a good example in a way, because people don't want to follow the leader. They want some pop singer or someone to, to follow. So maybe people involved in advertising could come up with a better idea of how to encourage the population to have the vaccine. We need some advertising people here, to sell it to people. You do need to have some incentive. And I think a lot of the Asian countries have not done very well in this respect, partly because they're not so worried about it. But if you get your vaccine card and you're able to travel, it lets you on the aeroplane. I think that's something that will sell it to a lot of people.
I know my father used to very regularly give blood, and the reason was, I don't know what they do here, but in Australia you used to get a beer after you gave blood to replenish your supplies, so maybe we need something like that. I'm going to ask a very simple and straight question. For a non-medical person, for a neophyte such as myself, and for us here in Macau, where is the best source of information for the latest? You said it varies a lot, right? New news. Where would you recommend a non-medical person go to get their information about what's going on with COVID-19 in the world today?
In the world? Well, of course, in Macau, the government does put out information, and in the Macau newspaper, they do publish the current information day by day. And in Hong Kong, if you look at the South China Morning Post, they do keep updating things pretty well on a worldwide basis. So, some of the local newspapers are doing a good job. If you look at the more international newspapers, I see the email from the New York Times every day, and that has it in as well. So if you look at a good newspaper, I think that gives you a good start. It may not always be entirely true, but it gives you a starting point. Yeah, and of course, a lot of things you'll see on various websites may not be true at all. So you always have to be very, very cautious in interpreting those things.
So not the QAnon Facebook group then. It's not the best place to go. Anybody else questions? One right up the back there. Oh, there we go.
Today, first thing in the morning, I read that the vaccination had been suspended in Macau and Hong Kong for the biotech, and it was due to packaging problems. And after that, I think I've read that its packaging means something to do with storage temperature, which I think is something like minus 70 degrees C. So what happens with the vaccine if it's supposed to be stored at 70 and it was, say, a minus 70 and it was stored at, say, minus 30?
Yeah, the requirement for the Pfizer-BioNTech is to store it at minus 70 to maintain the lipid nanoparticles intact. And if it's stored at a higher temperature for a long time, then the particles may not remain intact, and it will become less or ineffective. I didn't hear that bit. I mean, I've been following this news all day, because my second vaccination has been suspended as well. I didn't hear the bit that it was the storage temperature. The information I got was about the cap on the vial being defective, but it's still not definitive, so I don't know. I don't know, but as we understand it, the transport of that vaccine has to be around -70, and if it's at a higher temperature, it loses its efficacy.
Okay. Another thing that came up today, or in the last few days, was that depending where you travel in the future, you may have to have a certain vaccine. So if you go to China, you have a Sinopharm. If you go to Australia, you have a Pfizer. So can you actually have two vaccines?
Yes, you can. I mean, there's a lot of interest in mixing the vaccines, and there are studies in the UK, specific studies looking at mixing the vaccines. I think on balance that there's no harm in doing that, and it may have an additional advantage. Each of the vaccines has a certain sort of benefit and risk, and probably there's no great risk from mixing the vaccines. So, if you have to have that on your vaccine passport, you've had the Chinese vaccine, you've had the American vaccine, European vaccine, then you can go anywhere. So
yes, so the vaccines work together, not against each other.
No, they won't sort of negate each other.
Complement each other.
They should complement each other. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a follow-up question. How does the vaccine get disposed of that we cannot use? And the other question is there now only one available in Macau?
I don't know how they plan to dispose of it. Disposing of used or unused pharmaceuticals is quite a difficult problem. And they have to be dealt with very, very carefully. I mean, particularly the drugs that are used for cancer, because they're very toxic, and there are certain ways of disposing of them. I think with the vaccine, it's not a toxicity issue, but it's just a matter of throwing it away or putting it somewhere. They will normally send it back to the manufacturer. And right now in Macau, you only have one choice at the moment. But I don't know how they're going to roll out that choice. If you've had one shot of the BioNTech, are you now going to be allowed to have a shot of the Sinopharm? I don't know. Not been announced.
Brian, the body of research of the effect of the vaccine on children, I understand from one of my colleagues, is not large enough. So for children, they don't get vaccinated. What do you think that path is for kids?
There are no studies completed of using the vaccine in kids. There are ongoing studies with some of the vaccines in children, and we'll have results fairly soon, I guess. I don't think there's a concern in using them in children. It's just a matter of having the data to show that they work and that they're safe. The same for pregnant ladies. So, we normally give other vaccines to children, and they work fine without any particular problem. So I think we will soon be able to give them to children, and that will be important, because although children often don't get severe disease, they often have asymptomatic disease, they do carry it and they do spread it to the parents and to other people. So I think we will have to vaccinate children as well as the adult population.
Thank you. Professor, thank you very much. Very enlightening. Going back to the issue of allergic reactions to the vaccine. Have you seen any information, or has there been any study related to the possibility that someone that could, for example, could be allergic to could have an everyday allergy that is relatively common, like certain foods or certain medications, etc., there could be any correlation between certain types of everyday allergies and an allergic reaction to the vaccine that could be used as flags when the person fills out the questionnaire, what sort of diseases have you got, etc., etc. That could help to predict whether or not someone could have an allergic reaction to the vaccine.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Of course, a history of allergy is the most important contraindication to having the vaccine. But the allergy that they're talking about is severe allergy, not sort of, skin allergy to nickel or allergy to house dust mite causing asthma. It's a much more severe type of allergy, and particularly anyone who's ever had anaphylaxis before, the most severe allergic reaction, they should not have the vaccine. Whether that anaphylaxis was due to something related to the vaccine or not, one doesn't know. But anyone who is sort of capable of mounting that severe type of allergic reaction should avoid the vaccine. But other types of milder allergy, they don't really give you any clear indication. So you have to look at the type of allergy, the severity, and exactly what it was due to. And often we don't know. We don't know exactly what it's due to. And even in the cases that have had anaphylaxis, I think it's not been identified what component has caused the anaphylaxis. I've just suggested it's something in the lipid nanoparticle, maybe the polyethylene glycol, because that's something that you are exposed to in other substances, and is well known to cause severe allergic reactions. So it's difficult to identify, and you just have to be very cautious. And that's why all the vaccine centres are keeping people there for 30 minutes to see if they have anaphylaxis. And as far as I know, it's not happened in Macau. I don't know whether anyone has any knowledge that it has happened, but it seems not so far. Touch wood, if there's some wood to touch. But we don't want to see it happen.
Thanks, Professor, for clarifying so many doubts. I just had a question. The news today, if I'm not mistaken, the BioNTech batch was suspended because frontline workers in Hong Kong were reporting damaged vials.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask, if somebody received the first dose of BioNTech and the vial was damaged, would there be any health concerns, or it would be more an issue of the vaccine itself losing its efficiency because the vial was damaged?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand it, the damage is not a damage which will cause infection within the vial. There's no evidence that the vials have become infected and that you're injecting some infectious material. The worry is, as you say, that the vaccine was ineffective and that it will not produce immunity. And my colleagues and myself who have had that first dose of the vaccine are very worried. Have we been protected? And we don't know. We don't know. I've had calls from Hong Kong, asking the same thing. Are we protected? Because people in Hong Kong, I mean, my wife had it in Hong Kong on Monday. It's the same. So we're all in this situation, and it's very worrying.
Non-medical person, so I have a question. I don't know if there's any correlation. For example, I am not allowed to take the flu shot. I tried to take a few times, but because I'm allergic to penicillin, the health center doesn't want to administer the flu shot. They say I might develop certain allergic reactions. Now, my question would be, flu shot also uses inactivated virus, if I'm correct. And Sinovac, which is the vaccine from China, also uses the same technology, similar, right? Is an activated virus. Will that mean that I am not allowed to also take the Sinovac vaccine? Like, is there any correlation between, I mean, this is a curious question I wanted to ask for a long time. Penicillin allergy, what's the correlation with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Whether it's really such a contraindication to the flu shot. Some of the vaccines do have some antimicrobial in. I don't think they have penicillin in them, but it's conceivable as something that would cross-react with penicillin. The question I would ask you is, how severe is your allergy to penicillin?
Well, the last time they did the test, I had swelling of my arm, and I had rashes and elevated heartbeat. And then the hospital just came and gave me an antidote. They just came and injected me with something else.
So had you taken penicillin orally, you'd taken a tablet, or?
No, it was injection. It was
an injection of penicillin?
It was an injection, yeah. Actually, it was IV, intravenous. They gave me penicillin IV, and then suddenly I started swelling in my arm and I had rashes at the hospital. And then my heartbeat started elevated. Then they went and gave me another something, I don't know, an antidote or something. And then my heartbeat started slowing down.
I think it would be useful for you to see an allergy specialist and have some tests to determine your level of allergy. I don't think it would entirely prevent you from having the COVID-19 vaccine, but if you report what you said to the people administering it, they'll reject you.
That's why I have all red bars in all the hospitals, penicillin allergy.
But you really should see an allergy specialist and have a number of specialized tests, and find out exactly what the nature of the allergy is and what the severity would be, because it is important. It's important that everyone has the vaccine, unless it's totally contraindicated, and that's how we have to move forward.
I've just got one for you about production. People always ask me, when is this all going to be over? And I go, well, let's work this out. 330 million people in the US. They were trying to do 1 million a day, but apparently they're doing 2.5 million a day. Pretty impressive, actually. So 150 days gets them 1 shot, 300 days gets them 2. That's less than a year. Is it similar everywhere around the world? Can you do the math? And that assumes that we can just produce this vaccine and just keep producing it. Can we produce it as fast as we can use it up? And does that trajectory sound about right? If you do all the math, it seems about maybe Q4 we might have vaccinated induced herd immunity globally. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it's not going to work, because a lot of the poorer countries, it was mentioned in the press or on the web a day or two ago, countries like Kenya are not getting the vaccine. So there are going to be a lot of countries who are not going to get the vaccine rolled out, like in Australia and the US and the UK, and you can't sort of isolate different countries, I think. So, it's going to be a problem. And the rich countries have to do something to help the poor countries to get vaccinated. And it's sort of common sense in a way.
Time for just one more quick one up the back there.
Two, or maybe two. I just want to ask about the Chinese vaccine. So why isn't the West approving the use of the Chinese vaccines? And the efficacy rate is the lowest amongst the other ones you had shown. So any information, like most of us here that might have already had the Pfizer vaccine, if that's the only choice, give us a little bit more information around this particular vaccine.
Well, the approval of different vaccines varies in different parts of the world. The approval has to depend on the application. So China or the companies in China would have to apply in the United States to have their vaccine approved, and they haven't done that. And the approval body in the United States are very cautious and may not approve certain vaccines. They've been questioning about the AstraZeneca vaccine. The AstraZeneca has been approved in the UK, in many parts of Europe, in Australia for a long time. But the United States is a little bit reluctant to approve it. And the data's the same. So there are different approaches in different countries. And I'm sure as I mentioned in one of those slides that the United States will not approve some of the vaccines from other countries. And the countries may not even apply to have them approved. You know, I mean, they know it's a problem. And it's the same with all sorts of medications. You know, you don't get them approved in all countries simultaneously. So we're going to end up with this problem in that some vaccines are approved in some countries, some vaccines are approved in other countries. And as we're discussing with Keith, I think, you know, we're going to have some sort of international travel problems. You know, you're going to have multiple vaccines if you want to go everywhere.
Ben?
Thanks again for the presentation. Just a very quick question, and I suspect there are many others in the room, such as yourself, who've had one shot of the BioNTech vaccine. The next steps on the investigation that they are currently obviously involved in, what would you, I know it's completely unprecedented, but what would you expect to come from this? Would you expect that after, you know, a limited period of investigation and discovery that there were possibly no further examples of defective caps? I'm just curious as to the next few days, the next week or so, how that may play out and what you would maybe predict.
I think they will get more shipments of the BioNTech vaccine from Germany or other sources which have been properly checked in the first place, and we have the problem now of knowing whether people who had one shot need to have 2 more shots. You know, we don't know right at this point. You know, I mean, the information's very hot off the press, and we don't quite understand exactly what the problem is and what repercussion it's going to have. So I think we're going to get new batches coming in, but whether you're going to need to have one shot to make it 2 altogether, or you're going to have 2 more shots, I don't know. And we have to wait and see how this pans out.
Very good. Well, first of all, I'd like to ask you to thank Professor Tomlinson. Stay up there. For an excellent explanation and Q&A time. And I'd just like to stay in your seats and invite our chairman of AustCham Macau, Patrick Liu, to come up and present Professor Tomlinson with this certificate of appreciation.
Thank you, Patrick. We have the picture. Okay, thank you.
Very good. And we've got 2 minutes to spare, which is great. Just enough time for me to suggest that if you happen to be feeling a little bit thirsty, then we will be down at the 2nd floor at the St. Regis bar, which is, of course, very nice. And pop down there for a drink to support the St. Regis. And thank you all for coming once again to Power Hour. And we will see you next time, as always, on the 4th Wednesday of the month at 6:30 or so. We'll either see you in the bar or we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.